Bienvenidos, señoras y señores, a esta sesión de la edición 2021 de la Literatura Hoy, organizada por la Biblioteca Luis Ángel Arango con autores africanos para posibilitar el intercambio entre los continentes africano y América Latina. Las escrituras postcoloniales africanas son testimonios creativos de trayectorias de experiencias históricas que han configurado las identidades y definido el papel de las sociedades antiguamente colonizadas en un contexto global contemporáneo. Estas experiencias constituyen la base del florecimiento de producciones literarias que se proponen el deber de reexaminar el pasado, la urgencia de entender el presente y la necesidad de imaginar y de reinventar nuevos futuros. Hoy tenemos como invitada la poeta sudafricana Lebogang Mashile. Lebogang nació en Rhode Island, en Estados Unidos, donde sus padres vivieron en exilio durante los años del apartheid. Regresaron a su país en 1995 y después de iniciar estudios en Derecho en la Universidad de Witwatersrand, Lebogang se dedicó a su carrera en las artes y se destacó por su papel de actriz en la famosa película Hotel Rwanda sobre el genocidio en este país en 1994. Ella es autora de dos poemarios importantísimos. In a Ribbon of Rhythm, de 2005, con que ganó el Premio Noma en el mismo año, y en 2008 publicó también Flying Above the Sky. Ha participado en múltiples producciones cinematográficas y coreográficas, y en sus últimos años es la voz del programa de CNN Inside Africa. Además de ser escritora y actriz, Lebogang es conocida como una personalidad mediática y declamadora con prestaciones en foros internacionales en muchos países como en Sudáfrica, su país de nacimiento, Estados Unidos, en Cuba, en Suiza, Jamaica e incluso en mismo Colombia. Muchísimas gracias. Welcome, Lebogang, to this edition of Literatura Hoy.
Thank you so much for having me. It is my pleasure and my real honor to be here.
You're welcome. The pleasure is ours. So we are going to begin with a punch because I know you for your punch. So I want you to start this discussion with a performance of your poem, The Green of Words, on page 31 of your poetry collection, In a Ribbon of Rhythm.
I hear the sound of my mind in darkness, peppered with oceanic rumbles, deeper than history, lighter than air. An awakened mind is the thief of my sleep. I yawn, shake off the dust of slam poetry expectations and relive the green of words, where the world is no obstacle to my desire. The bold quiet honors me as midwife to poetry, unpretentious, unrelenting, unexpected interpretations of the sliced days that pass through this body. The dangerous safety of lined paper beckons. I hear myself respond, seduced by the storyteller. I am inspiration.
Thank you very much, Lebo. And it's a poem full of imagery and full of themes. I mean, like the various themes that cut across, your poetic production. And we will have the time to go back to some of those themes in the course of our discussion. But I want us to begin about your personality, your person, so to speak. You were born in circumstances that predispose you to have a particular understanding of what it means to write. I mean, being born in exile, having as background a cruel regime known globally, the apartheid regime in South Africa. So I wanted to tell us, I mean, how do these historical circumstances, condition what you think about writing, like the duty of a writer, how does it condition, your whole understanding of writing? Particular, being born in exile?
I think there's a reason why so many artists are people who come from backgrounds that are challenging in terms of identity, movement, traveling across borders, whether those are, borders of gender identity and sexuality or nationalistic borders, identity borders. I think that this tension, this challenge, gives birth to a resilience and a creativity, a curiosity, that is at the heart of what the creative process is, I think kids who grow up under these circumstances, and I don't think that I am unique, I'm the child of immigrants who left a country that had difficult circumstances to go to the West to seek safety, education, a better life, while the country was in turmoil. And I mean, that is the story of people from Nicaragua, people from Colombia, people from the Caribbean, people from Southeast Asia, people from West Africa, people from East Africa. It's the post-colonial story, of migration. So mine happened to be because of apartheid. Apartheid was a system of racialized segregation and oppression that was legal for many years in South Africa. Apartheid was legal for, gosh, almost 50 years. Prior to that, we had 300 years of colonialism, so, and also slavery as well in a part of this country, in the Cape. So these are forces that I think many countries can relate to: racialized segregation, oppression, colonialism, the inequality that comes from that. My parents left as students to go and study in America. And I grew up in a place called Providence, Rhode Island, which happens to be full of immigrants. It's a very small state, but percentage-wise, it has one of the highest concentration of immigrants in the United States. So I kind of took it for granted because I grew up around first generation immigrants, although we met that kind of American culture, but I grew up around kids from Cambodia and Laos and Russia and Haiti and Puerto Rico and Dominican Republic and Liberia, Nigeria. I think all of us were in a similar kind of struggle, What made my story unique is that my family went back to South Africa after South Africa changed. So I have this dual experience of being an outsider in kind of two different homes, Um, and at South Africa, because of the history that I've described, it's a society that I believe it's a very divided society that's trying to come to terms with itself. So in a strange way, everyone feels like an outsider in South Africa, The privilege for me as an artist is to be able to examine this condition, It's a privilege to be a part of the society, but also to be an outsider in the society, to be rejected by the society, because I can look at the society at a distance, I think this journey between kind of distance, insider, outsider, belonging, not belonging, having to travel these borders, I think this is what makes a creative life necessary for us to be able to understand our identity issues.
What you've said is quite interesting. I mean, so your writing is born out of crisis, and and that actually, some sort of shapes even the ethical worldviews that one finds in your works.
Yes.
And we are going to talk about that. But what you said also struck me because it's something at the heart of post-colonial writing. And your last statement reminds me of the work by Edward Said, like the pillar of post-colonial writings. In his works, out of place, autobiography, out of place. So he says he finds himself always out of place. So he's always in a condition of exile. But intellectually speaking, that permits him to to put to bear critical, perspective, on society, so he's never at ease. So he does what some call the aesthetic of discomfort, so he's totally, on the borderlines, trying to look at things critically, concerned with those who are excluded, from a particular political space, or community. So it's quite interesting. And in one of your poems, I mean, inside, outside, I find a very interesting dimension of, how these circumstances condition even your views about home or homelessness. I mean, you say in inside and outsider, inside outsider, I am tired of being different. My feet burn from fires of those who have been anointed with the certainty of origins. I will wander the earth in search of my tribe or build it from the shreds of boxes with my own hands. So there's a strong vision of what home means to you. Maybe you want to comment about that.
I think my sense of justice, to pick up on the first part of your question, your comment, my sense of justice comes, I think, from my family, because because of the circumstances that made my parents leave South Africa. Home and the politics of South Africa, what was happening in South Africa, was an ever-present reality in our house. My mother is an activist, was an activist. She was a part of the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa and in the United States. So it was growing up. Activism was a part of the language of our house. What wasn't a part of the language of our house was the emotional side. Now as an adult, I'm starting to understand things like PTSD. I think, it took a whole nother generation to come into itself for us to begin to speak about mental illness as something that is very connected to our experiences as marginalized people. So it's this new generation. I cannot even claim it for my own generation. I think it's the generation that comes after us, that it comes after me, certainly, that is mainstreaming this understanding of mental illness. But when I look back on my own experience growing up, it was very difficult for my parents to speak about their own emotions. They come from a different generation, so they could tell us about the ANC and what was happening in the South Africa. They could tell us about what was happening on the news, how to deconstruct it, but they couldn't tell us about what was happening inside their hearts, inside of them. They couldn't tell us about the generational pathologies that we have inherited that are a result also of the trauma in my country. They didn't have a language for that, but we were experiencing all of this simultaneously. I think being very sensitive and being somebody who, part of my own journey, as you said, being a writer often is born out of this crisis, so one of the crises was also trying to give language to the heart experience.
Yeah.
Finding a language for the emotions that come with the kind of traumas that my family had experienced, the trauma of exile, the trauma of being away from home, the trauma of being immigrants, but also the blessings that are also that accompany that condition as well. I think for me, claiming identity, in all of its complexity, claiming my identity for myself is a radical act, to say that I am a South African and that I belong in this country and that the full breadth of my life experience can be housed in this place, is a radical act. And I think that is something that is necessary, not necessarily in terms of, not that you have to claim it in a nationalistic sense, right? You can claim more than even one nationality if you want to, if that is your experience, but to claim your identity for yourself, to not have it prescribed to you. One of the really damaging things that apartheid did to South Africans is to put identities in such rigid boxes. We see each other, we define each other according to race, according to color, according to class, according to ethnicity, according to language. Within seconds of interacting with a human being, you've already tried to put them in a box, because that is what apartheid did to us. To say to the world and to myself, I resist whatever box you're trying to put me in. This is my identity for myself. And even if you put me in the box, that's you. It's not me,
Yeah.
So I do think that creativity is essential to the kind of justice that we are trying to bring into the world.
Okay.
You know,
Yes.
we're in this incredible moment of awakening. Um, so many marginalized identities are finding their voice in a way that they have not been allowed to, in a way that we have not seen, in numbers that we have not seen before, from queer people to Palestinians to the traumas, that the horrors that we've been inflicting on the environment, and indigenous people who are defending their environments, the traumas of hundreds of years ago. Look at what is happening in Canada right now, where the indigenous people are discovering and bringing to the fore the stories of their ancestors who were taken to these boarding schools where they were tortured and killed by the
So,
colonial powers. You know, these are hundreds of years old ghosts that are coming and being brought into the main for us to understand and purge and heal and be accountable for. That process, creativity is essential to that process. You know,
exactly.
it's yeah.
Yeah.
The only way we're going to be able to make sense of all of this is through art. So the just a strong sense of social justice is something that I can't say I gave to myself. I inherited it from my family, but it's something that I deliberately choose to give fruit to in my work and also in the way that I define myself.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks so much, Lebo. I mean, like, when you were talking about like the circumstances under which like talking about living with immigrants from all these parts of the world and how it also shapes your cosmopolitan, manner of looking at things. I mean, you've written a poem, called "My Imagined Community," and I find it quite interesting. Your imagined community is not these categories. I mean, like you don't put these categories in your imagined community. It's an embrace of humanity in the very inclusive sense, against all these contingents, compartmentalization of, so I think when you say in your poem, in my imagined community, bound together by those bound together by slavery, by colonization, by poverty, by AIDS, by drugs, by abuse. We are fighting the silence. It's a very potent message, and I find connections with what the Uruguayan writer. Uh, Eduardo Galeano, talks about when he says that the nobodies of this world. So it seems your politics is a politics in favor of the nobodies of this world. In Spanish, he says los nadis de ese mundo, the nobodies of this world. Those that don't have languages, they have only dialects. You know, those yeah. So I find this trend quite strong in your poetry, and your response to this oppression is with love, what others would call decolonial love. I mean, so you preach this radical love for the other, and it comes out in the poem that you and I were talking about. That you and I, the poem itself is you and I. But when we love with the heat that rises like a sun in flight on the flesh of our backs. Maybe you have a comment on that. That this insistence on love, on love that runs through. I mean, if there's one thing I retain from your poetry is that image of self-love. First of all, of course, you cannot love others if you don't love yourself, but also the love of the other, the face of the other.
Thank you so much. Wow. No one has ever said that to me as clearly, as profoundly as you have said it to me. I appreciate it very much. Um, I mean, I think it's all of it is a process, I write about what challenges me the most. I write about what provokes me the most. I write about what the difficulties that are demanding, that are insisting on presence in my life, So I don't think self-love is not a destination, it's a process, it's a journey, it's a coming and a going. It comes in waves. Sometimes I feel so far from it, sometimes I feel so close to it, but it's the desire for it as a tool to assist me in navigating this life, is ever present. And I think as I grow, understanding that in the complexity of life, that light and darkness coexist together, the traumas and the horrors of my childhood coexist with the blessings of my childhood, so even the most destructive and overlooked parts of myself, the parts of myself that I don't want to acknowledge, those are they are as present in my being as the gifts and the talents and the wonderful things that other people can see and acknowledge. They exist. So in that, how do I then, and I say this, I mean, it's a heavy question that I ask. I mean, I say it as an activist, I say it as somebody who cares very deeply about Black people, who cares very deeply about marginalized people, about women, but whatever darkness I see in my oppressor, I also see it in myself. And if I see it in myself, I have to have empathy for it. So how can I not, at very least, be able to see some sliver of humanity in my oppressor, And I know these are politics, especially in our contemporary language, where, you know, um, there's a strong urge to demand like the reparations that we deserve as people who have been hurt and wounded by the systems of our society, and that comes out in very visceral, passionate ways. People are demanding justice, even cancel culture with all of its problems, it's people who are demanding justice in the face of systems that have not given people justice. But we have to acknowledge, but for me, I have to acknowledge that there's an imperfection embedded in that, because how do I cancel the parts of myself that I don't like? How do I cancel the parts of the people that I love that I don't like? It's right now in South Africa, we are experiencing the kind of the post-apartheid, the bubble of freedom that we were in, of hope and possibility, is melting. It's coming crashing down. Our government is corrupt. We've been in lockdown for a very long time. Vaccine distribution is very slow. We are the past year that could have been used to help our people, our politicians have used that time and those resources to enrich themselves at the expense of our people. As a result, we are in the third wave of lockdown and the third wave of the pandemic right now, while people in the global north are getting vaccines and are opening up and are enjoying summer. um, so when I talk about, my oppressor, I'm talking about the historical oppressor, the white people who built, these systems that did so much damage. But I'm also asking myself, how is it possible that Black people, freedom fighters, took over the very same systems and became exactly like their oppressors? So it's an energetic thing. Yes, we have to understand how we arrived at this point. And in order to do that, we have to acknowledge anti-Blackness, we have to acknowledge racism, we have to acknowledge xenophobia, homophobia, sexism, all of that, how we got to this place. But then we also have to acknowledge how each of these live in us. These diseases, they're in us, And if I can do that, then by default, I have empathy, you know? So I guess I'm not talking about the love of, the kind of the commodification of love. I'm not talking about, self-love, the way self-care has been packaged as this band-aid, for trauma, right? I'm not talking about, the Rainbow Nation PR solution that was decided in London and given to us as South Africans as a band-aid to cover bleeding wounds of trauma and injustice and inequality that we are still bleeding from. I'm not talking about, love as as a as something to whitewash the truth. I'm talking about the hard work of love, the labor of love, the love as a radical act, love as a tool of resistance,
Yes.
love as a container that can hold disparate thoughts, that can hold complexity, you know because otherwise, if we don't find that, then our societies implode. And we've seen that over and over again. We've seen that over and over again in Latin America. We've seen that over and over again on this continent. We're seeing it in South Africa now.
Yeah. So you mean this kind of this self-critical love, where you also recognize that aspects that you blame on your oppressor, I mean, are also part of the internal self, and you need to have the courage to actually point that out, to work on that from within.
Yes.
In that sense. Okay. I was going to to ask you another question that is a bit close to that, but also in another dimension about an issue that I discussed recently with Titi Dangaremba, who was also part of this series.
Oh, I love Titi very much.
Yes,
Yes.
and
Yes.
and she was also happy that you were going to be part of this. So we're talking about her novel nervous condition that even set in a period where the second Chimurenga in Zimbabwe was ongoing. She decided to write about a different kind of politics, about the struggle, for identity by these young female characters. And so the idea was that the title of the novel is actually taken from, Franz Fanon's, Wretched of the Earth. So like nervous
So
condition.
nervous condition of
Yes.
blackness.
Of
Yes.
blackness,
Yes.
exactly.
Yes.
So but in that sense, I mean, in that novel, Titi decided to focus on the self identity of young female characters, as to say, the political debates, some sort of way were performed through a lens of masculinity, and the concerns of the feminist, I mean, or not, or of the female genre, were not taken care of. I mean, so I'm beginning. I was also wondering, in the case of apartheid, because I see a very strong feminist tonality in your work, in your poetry.
Yes.
If you also have the same feeling that the aspect of of female representation, female empowerment, have not been adequately handled in a way that the discourse of apartheid struggle, or resistance to apartheid, might also be very masculinist, in the way it is shaped. And so that's why maybe there's also this strong feminist tonality in your poetry. I take as example the poem Ancient Ones, for example, where you say, but I hold the pen of every witch and or bitch, with black magic in her veins, who seeks to love beyond the silences and claim back the sanctity of her dreams. Because there is a pen for every sister and every mother in every home. There's a healer in every hands that writes the lines of every poem. So the power, in the hands of the female genre. I mean, I wanted to expand on that, because it comes across quite frequently in your poetry.
I really adore Tsitsi. Her book, Nervous Conditions, was a lifeline for me as a young woman, as a student, grappling with these issues, looking for answers, not having a language for the struggles that I was experiencing in coming into my own understanding of my politics, my own understanding of my voice. Tsitsi centered the voice of young Black women who are navigating this terrain and not finding a place that understands or fits, where they can fit in, where we can fit in, because people are just not used to Black women, Black girls being liberated in any way. So even just the mere fact of your liberation or attempt at liberation is such a threat. There's no space for it in this society. Zizi, in writing, helps to give a space for that. And I mean, her contemporaries and her predecessors helped to do that. People like Buche Emechita, people like Gnamhlope in South Africa, people like Bessie Head, people like Maria Maba, people like uh, um, Miriam Tadi in South Africa. And these women also experienced intense backlash. Nawal El Sadawi, who we recently lost, these are women who experienced intense backlash in their societies, in their countries, for centering the voices of African women, in as much as they have enjoyed success and have been canonized and are taught, and these are women who lived incredibly difficult lives because they just wanted to be seen as human in their lives and in their rights. So I think when my generation of writers emerged in South Africa in the last 20 years, we've seen an explosion of Black women writers, particularly in poetry. And I think it's really interesting that many women are choosing this particular form. In poetry in South Africa, is the roots of poetry go very deep. We have we have an oral tradition, an oral canon that is used to preserve, genealogy, our names, our histories. So the poet occupying public space, sharing orality, performing, is something that goes back, millennia in this part of the world, and I think in different parts of the continent and the world too. So in more recent history, during apartheid, poetry and many art forms became tools of resistance against the regime. And as you said in your question, when we look at the liberation movements, the struggle that the liberation movement was focused on was ending apartheid, ending the white minority rule in South Africa. And in that project, they also, as much as there were women who were participating in those liberations, as much as there were women activists and women who were fighting alongside men in the trenches and being incarcerated alongside men and bearing the brunt of this oppression alongside men, when it came to who the enemy was, the liberation movement said, let's bring down apartheid first, and then we'll answer the question of gender. Then we'll come to deal with, your issues as women. So women's issues were marginalized. Women writers were marginalized. Women writers were marginalized even within progressive, left formations that existed solely to tackle this regime. Women's voices within those movements were marginalized. So when we came, I think, as a post apartheid, when this cultural explosion happened, and it happened across genres. I mean, visual art, music, youth culture, literature. I feel very fortunate that I emerged in this window of hope and possibility. So many women emerged in that time too, and it was a breath of fresh air because people were like, where has this been? We've never seen this before. I think it's also very interesting that you kind of see this happening all over the continent in different ways. If you look at fiction, even if you look at the writers that have been most visible in globally, the writers that have been kind of standard bearers for contemporary African literature right now, many of them are women, certainly in numbers that we've never seen before. And I think it has a lot to do with the fact that, again, women, because we are marginalized, because we are seen as inferior, because the things that we have been socialized to embrace as women as strengths that are diminished by men and by patriarchy, we have access to these tools when it comes to our writing. I'm thinking specifically of our emotions, men are taught not to cry. Men are taught to suppress their emotions. Men are taught to suppress how they feel. Men are allowed a very small, limited, narrow range of emotional expression, women are seen as weak because we are allowed access to our emotions. Not to say that every woman is emotional. I mean, I'm speaking in very general terms, but we are allowed access to feelings. We are allowed access to our tears. We are allowed access to soft, vulnerable emotions. And this changes the texture and the quality of the way that women write. Women are able to write the interior in ways that men can't write the interior because men have been oppressed by patriarchy too. Patriarchy has silenced men and men's ability to access their emotions. So right now, this is giving women an edge. I mean, Toni Morrison talks about how the more complicated your experience is as a human being, the more complicated, the more you bring to your writing, you know? So marginalized people, the more marginalized you are, the more lenses through which you have to perceive life, to perceive the mainstream, the more tools you have at your disposal to understand reality, you know? So I am, as much as, you know, the literary space continues to be very misogynistic, racist, anti-Black, colonial space, I am emboldened by what I've seen African women do, my contemporaries and the ones who are coming after, who are pushing boundaries in incredible ways. I think we have not even begun to really examine what this contribution means for our literature going forward. It makes me feel very excited to be a creative right now, you know, to know that somebody like Zizi, like, you know, to go back where we started, someone like Zizi, when that book came out, the backlash that Zizi got was the same as the backlash that Alice Walker got for writing The Color Purple. And she received that backlash not from, I mean, there was the outright racism that she got from white people, from Europe, from the West, but there was the misogyny that she received from Black men, from African men, from the literary community here on the continent. To watch Tsitsi go from that to being shortlisted for a Booker, you know, in one lifetime. I mean, of course, it's infinitely more complicated because there was Tsitsi 2 weeks before she was announced on the shortlist. She was arrested in Zimbabwe for protesting injustice, which she has done consistently, you know, throughout her life. But to be able to see things come full circle in that way, it shows that there's been a phenomenal shift in our culture. And I think women have such an important role to play. For it feels like, but women have always contributed to the creative arts and to so many aspects of society in general. But our contributions have been erased. You know, I think we are entering a phase where we are able to name our contributions, and I think the ripple effect of that is enormous.
To say that, I mean, for this series of dialogues, you know, between African literature and Latin American literature that we are doing now, unconsciously, the majority of those, I mean, of the authors are females. I didn't do that as a way of, you know, I don't know, female. I mean, it was just unconsciously for me that authors that I felt, you know, would strike, you know, I use the word strike intentionally, the Latin American audience, the way your poetry struck, you know, like the participants in my creative writing workshop are mostly females, you know,
Yeah.
are mostly female authors, and so just to say that we I mean, in this program we really are on the right track, so to say.
It's what I think it speaks to what is happening in contemporary African literature
Exactly,
across the
exactly.
board, you know? Yeah.
Exactly, and talk, you know, you actually talk about the, you know, we've talked about the dimension of, like, the feminist dimension in your works, but there's another dimension that I found even you know, quite interesting too, and that is that of childhood. Infancy or childhood is always some sort of also, you know, just totally marginalized, you know, as lack of maturity, as lack of perception. But I think you make a very interesting use of your childhood, I mean, your background, your childhood, to some sort of build your ethics, you know, from that childhood, you know. So there's a consistent recourse that you make to childhood that I find totally interesting. I mean, I found it in a lot of poems, from Every Child, My Child, Desert Child, from A Tangled Web of Rainbows, at Three,
Mm,
Everything is Love.
mm.
What is it in childhood that you some sort of anchor an entire collection, you know, on childhood and what it can teach us?
At the time when the book came out, or let me say when I was writing the book, I was in the process of just examining my own experience, myself, the seeds of my formation, and how they had shaped the person that I had was becoming at the time. And I mean, so much process work, psychological work insists on an examination of the childhood, of our past, of the circumstances that created us. We carry so much within us from the earliest parts of our lives, the seeds of our wiring, as our mental wiring, our emotional wiring is sown in that time. We are, you know, the blueprint of the initial blueprint that we are given to navigate life comes in that time, you know, and then kind of character, personality, all these other things come on top, you know. So I mean, if you want to make any kind of changes in your own behavior, in understanding your psyche, if you want to remodel yourself, you have to go back to that early blueprint. You have to unpack that early trauma, you know. I find a South African writer, social commentator, Barry Ronga, many years ago, wrote that, you know, traveling through life, you find that your trauma becomes like the rings that grow around a tree, you know. So you start with the initial trauma, but every year, you know, a layer grows, or time passes and another layer grows and another layer grows and another layer grows. So as time moves on, you know, you've distanced yourself from the trauma, your perspective on it changes the more you travel around it. And I find this idea to be very true. I find it to be empowering. um, Childhood also, I think, is critical because it the artists the artist is essentially a child at play. In order to create, you have to tap into the kind of primal, childlike state of wonder, of play, of fearlessness, of not being afraid of trying new things. I might fall, you know, but I'm going to get back up. I'm going to learn. I might drown, but I'm going to try. I'm going to go back into the sea again. You know, in order to make something out of nothing, which is what artists essentially do. We reach into the subconscious and we pull out what we've envisioned and bring it into reality. In order to do that, you have to be vulnerable and open and willing to be a child again. um, it's interesting that, you know, particularly in that first collection, I was definitely, you know, processing my own childhood, processing the creative voice as a childlike voice. But South Africa, and another layer was South Africa was in its infancy as a post-apartheid society as well. So there was this sense of, I mean, this is also an ancient society with cultures that go back, you know, hundreds of years. But it's a in that window of, you know, the first 10 years of our democracy, this country was like a child. It was like a baby. There was newness, there was freshness, there was a rebirth, you know. Now I look back on that period as a mother, and I mean, I've got my own small children. My children are 10 and 5, and it's very interesting to see that, even, you know, in a poem like Every Child, like, I was writing as a mother before I even became a mother, you know. There was the sense of kind of throwing forward to a future as well that didn't exist yet, you know, the presence of children, even though I did not have my own children. And I think that even as a mother now, I think that is so much more important to me as a value system, is creating a society that is safe for children, that centers children and the childhood experience. Because unless we do that, we'll continue to perpetuate the traumas that we see in our society. Most of these traumatized adults are acting out of childhood trauma and all of the traumas that came on top of the childhood trauma, you know. But as a society, we have not figured out yet how to center the experiences collectively of children, so that we create a society where children don't have to be traumatized, you know. And that is everyone's work, whether you have children or don't have children. If we create spaces that are safer for children, the space will be safe for everyone, you know. So the work of caring for children, interacting with children, centering children, valuing childhood is human work. It's not just the work of, parents, people, or mothers in particular, right? Women, caregivers, the people that we've tasked with the responsibility of turning these kids into adults and who we blame when they become adults that we don't like, right? It's everyone's work. And this has become much more critical to me now that I'm a mother and that I'm at this phase of my life.
That's an experience that I can easily relate to, because I also write, and my two creative books so far, I use also the perspective of the child. The first one that I wrote, published in 2019, is called Letter from America. That was my voyage, my first ever trip to Latin America in Peru. And I was imagining, I called it Letter from America, Memoirs of an Adopted Child. I use also like the perspective of an adopted child, because when you're adopted child, I mean you are in and out. There's always this cross border sentiment, and I also thought that, I mean, to get into a new culture, you must become a child in order to relate. I mean, to unlearn, as Gayatri speaks, I mean, tells us, I mean, to unlearn our privilege, as so it's quite interesting. And I also wrote another book again called The Radio and Other Stories, where I was trying to imagine how the fact that our house is close to the road made me attuned to newness, made me attuned to meeting new people every day. So my joy in life is when I meet somebody new. And the aesthetics of the veranda that actually opens up to the road, also it plays a very important role in who I've become, and my ethics of relationality are very much shaped by that childhood. So I relate very much with that. And now I want us to go to another direction in this interview, in terms of the arts, the arts of what do you do, the arts, the slam poetry, the spoken word. And growing, I mean, being born in the United States, there's also a long tradition, of the Afro-American tradition of the spoken word, which is quite important. We see it developed into music, developed into a pastoral work, like the very great orators, but also as an African. I mean, when I say African in terms of continental, you actually have the recent immigration, wave of immigration. So you are also a child of a tradition, an oral tradition. So how did these two, traditions, of course, originally all are African, but they developed, how did they connive? Permit me use the word. I mean, to produce Lebo, and the passion that she has for spoken word, and the energy that comes with it.
Before I became aware of how much I had been influenced by my parents' politics, I was heavily influenced by the politics that were coming through conscious hip hop in America in the 90s. And I can't say that it was necessarily like a deliberate choice to be conscientized. It was, it kind of happened. I found myself in the US, in the late 80s, early 90s. I was actually there for the whole of the 80s and up until 1995. But that window from like the late 90s into like the mid 90s, mid to late 90s, was really such a wonderful golden era for hip hop music, and there were so many conscious artists at that time who I didn't realize at the time, but who were informing my self definition, who were giving me access to politics and values that would become very important to me, but via popular culture. So yes, and I mean, now realizing how deep those roots go, that electronic music art form that was created by young inner city Black kids, that many of those kids were also children of immigrants, that they were borrowing from the DJing culture in the Caribbean, in Jamaica. So there's this cross pollination between, I think, Black imaginations. It's an uninterrupted thing. This is what we do with each other. This is what happens. And then coming back to South Africa and realizing that all of this is part of a much older, much deeper institution of creativity that is so embedded with our identities, you know. I think that the what we do is eternal, you know. For human beings, uh, from the second that human beings uh, realize that they are human and form communities, you know, we language, the creation of language and the creation of culture is one of the hallmarks of civilization. That's how you know that a people are actually a people, you know. But when we start to make art, and I mean, poetry is elemental. It's human. People make language, and then very soon after, they start singing and they start making poems, figuring out how to take this very primal human function and necessity and make it translate into forms and shapes that allow me to be able to express myself in a contemporary context is the challenge of my work. That's what my praxis is built around, is how do I make poetry live in different spaces, you know. And I mean, and what is this poetry, right? It's about language, it's about rhythm, it's about messaging, it's about a form that can live, that must live first and foremost on the page. On the page, the words must be able to stand on the page. The page is a very different experience to the stage, you know. The stage is a very different experience to the ear, you know. The ear is a very different experience to the eye. So all of these mediums are connected. But I think the beautiful challenge is trying to figure out how to allow a piece of work to live where it is supposed to live, um, as truthfully as it can, you know. So for me, my truth starts with paper. I am a reader, you know, before I am a writer or a performer. It's very important for me that my work stands the test of time in books. And the books are are a very intimate experience. You keep your book with you. I mean, now people are reading on their phones, right? They're reading on their laptops, but the act of consuming text in this way is a very intimate act nowadays. I mean, 100 years ago, you know, 150 years ago, whatever, Victorians sat in their parlors and read poetry to each other, you know. Civilized people did things like that in the West, right? We stand at functions, at family functions, at funerals, at after battles, and we say speeches and poems to each other, you know. But the act of, I think, reading is a solitary act, you know. The relationship between the reader and the author is such an intimate and vulnerable relationship. um, for me, the being a performer, I have to let that relationship go almost in order to then perform the words. I had a director once, Jerry Mofokeng, who I was doing a theatrical production called Threads. I was working with dancers, which has been such an interesting uh, tool for me as well artistically, is trying to find as many different kinds of artists that I can collaborate with to also push the form that I work with, you know. So working with dancers forced me to write language that has to move, language that has to have air and flight, and that can be choreographed, you know, which is a very different thing to just writing for myself or for the page or for, you know, it's a very different thing to writing a piece that is going to be it turned into a piece of visual art, you know. Then the words themselves now have to be treated as a visual character, you know. All of these, I think, help to expand the reach of my work and give me more things to work with when I am approaching creating work. I love collaborating with artists. I love working across medium. Working with the dancers was a big revelation for me, because in having to write those words that can be danced, that can move, I was working with a director named Jerry Mufokeng, and at one point in one of the rehearsals, he said to me, "You're writing on stage, and I can see that you are doing that." He was like, you're writing. Like, and he was right. I was, I'm kind of editing in my head, and in my head, I'm asking myself questions about, do I really like this line, or am I sure, or does this piece work? He's like, respect the writer, even when the writer is you. So the writer has their role. Once the piece is done, put that poem down and become the performer, and respect yourself as though your own words are written by another poet that you respect.
Thanks so much. We are moving towards a close, but I will want to ask some two very short questions that would require short answers.
Okay.
One is, I mean, let us move the question of censorship, I mean, to the political, because your work requires that you do spoken word in events. Sometimes they are political events, and in an environment as charged as post-apartheid South Africa, where politics has been so visceral, as you rightly said at the beginning. Has it occurred to you that sometimes, what you say on stage uh, doesn't go down well with some political elements present in the audience, and how, or you also auto-censor yourself, self-censorship at some point? Just a very brief question.
Yeah. I mean, the South Africa has freedom of speech according to the constitution, but as we know, like our governments on the African continents, they are strongman governments. We've got strongman politics. So freedom of speech only goes so far. I mean, I live in a society where I won't be killed for what I say, but at least not now, thank God. But I can be killed economically, I can be silenced, I can be sidelined, I can lose work. I have been forced to do many different things to be able to make a living as an artist. One of the reasons why I have collaborated with so many different kinds of artists, and why I work in so many different mediums, is purely because of survival. It's become a wonderful skill set. You know what I mean? But I mean, if you piss off the government that it's in favor, they're not going to book you for gigs. You got to find another way to earn a living. So I've been, and the thing is also, they won't come outright and say you are an enemy of the state. You just feel them slightly cool off and turn their attention elsewhere. Also, likewise, I have in trying to maintain, my own, I guess, artistic integrity, I've also at certain points deliberately chosen to not collaborate with the government as well. When Jacob Zuma was state president, I didn't do any presidential events at all. Even when I was broke. So it's I think you I'm 42. I've been doing what I do now for 20 years, 20 more than 20 years. So now it's pretty well known what it is that I stand for. And the nice thing also about being I guess more mature at this phase of my life is being able to see, things kind of come full circle. So I remember the backlash that I experienced following Jacob Zuma's rape trial, and coming out in support of the woman that he had raped, who has since passed away, Fezeka Nzukela Kuzwayo, who was known during that time as Quiz. And I immediately felt, how the kind of the insidious seen but unseen hostility coming from even the environment where I was working, on television. Um, and now, 4 days ago, they said Jacob Zuma is going to be arrested. Has to go to jail, for 15 months for not wanting to appear at an anti-corruption commission. So, I mean, not to say, I mean, this is a man who's hurt many people. And I guess in my brief lifetime, I've been able to see examples of how speaking the truth in the moment can have devastating repercussions, but in the long run, how one is always, I think, thankful for holding on to your own moral compass. If it is on, if you are being true to yourself in that moment, you'll be able to stand by your decision later on, I think.
Now we will do a poem, a penultimate poem then. And the poem that I want us to do is Havana.
Oh,
Page
okay. I thought you
63.
wanted you and I.
No, it's actually like the penultimate poem. I mean, so I want to ask you a question related to Havana. So very brief question. And then, so you read Havana, and then I will, table my question, and then you read the closing poem, which is actually, the closing poem will actually be tell you a story.
In future, the world will look at your face and see itself, a child of many places. Like everything, you too are born of jazz.
Exactly. I wanted you to read that because of the connections that we're seeking to, to establish or to throw light on, between Africa and Latin America. So Cuba, what does Cuba mean to you? You've evoked jazz, the musical connection, but also there is Cuba, the country that contributed so much, to the liberation of South Africa. So I wanted to just very briefly, and then we do the final poem.
There's a long and strong political allegiance between South Africa and Cuba. And even when, Mandela came into power and the West was insisting that Castro is a dictator and that South Africa should sever allegiances with Cuba, not just Cuba, but also with the Palestinian liberation movements as well. And Mandela, our leaders at the time, said, there's no way we can turn our back on Cuba. Cuba has never turned its back on us. When I experienced Cuba for the first time, I had the privilege of performing there many years ago. And I was really shocked by how important culture was to the Cuban identity, that in spite of, the economic challenges, and I went to Cuba, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and, so the Cuba was economically really struggling, but culturally what they had invested in had given the society this other kind of capital, this incredible resource. You'd go into a cultural center and you'd find these young, beautiful brown kids doing ballet or playing jazz. Or so when I referenced jazz, I was referencing what I saw. That culture didn't have to be this thing that was so commodified. It didn't have to be something that you can only access when you have money. It only becomes important once you've satisfied your basic need. That culture actually is a basic need. I also saw that echoed in Colombia. I still am very much inspired by the houses of culture, by the palace of culture. My experience of Colombia and of Medellin is still something that I share up to this day with people in this country and around the world, for how you make culture accessible to ordinary people. I wish that South Africa had houses of culture, had places where, in walking distance from everyone, where we could go and experience some kind of art, some kind of culture in our community. The level of literacy, of kind of literacy in the sense of really being able to understand depth and meaning in artistic offerings. The level of literacy that I experienced in Colombia across the board, I've not experienced anywhere else. I would have to maybe a place like Germany, where they really make a big deal about caring about culture and investing lots of money into it, just in the sense, Medellin Poetry Festival, people sit for 8 hours and you can hear a pin drop at an outside amphitheater listening to poetry. And you can hear that what is resonating is the poetry that's good. So when I'm speaking about literacy, I'm speaking about that is a gift that you give to your society. You give your society the gift of creativity, of being able to understand complexity, of being able to see, analyze, perceive, integrate art into their lives. I've seen that done in Latin America. My experience of Latin America is Cuba and Colombia, so it's incredibly limited. But I've seen that done in Latin America in ways that, if South Africa could do that, it would be heaven on earth, And what for me is exciting about that is that these are countries that come from similar backgrounds, that have similar traumas, that are dealing with similar issues of inequality, similar economic issues. So we don't have to look, to the West for models. We can look to each other.
That's a very wonderful parting shot there, and it's my wish that with the situation, Corona, maybe we would have the chance to still go back to Colombia, and and we'll do these festivals, of course, in the premises of the Biblioteca Luis Ángel Arango, which is organizing this exchange, but also in the the Cartagena and also in Choco, like the hubs of Afro-descendant populations in that country.
Oh, that would be wonderful.
Thanks so much, Lebo. We're moving close to the end of this program, and usually we request our guests to read, a passage. If it's a novel, a passage. If it's a poetry collection, a poem. And of course, you are the right person because your work consists in performing the words. So, in that light, I want you to perform for us. Tell your story on page 46 of. In your collection, so in a ribbon of rhythm. So please tell your story.
After they've fed off your memories, erased the dreams from your eyes, broken the seams of your sanity and glued what's left together with lies. After the choices and the voices have left you alone, and the silence grows solid, adhering like flesh to your bones. They've always known your spirit's home lay in your gentle sway to light and substance, but jaded mirrors and false prophets have a way of removing you from yourself. You who lives with many names, you who walks with a million faces, none can eliminate your pain. Tell your story. Let it nourish you, sustain you, and claim you. Tell your story. Let it feed you, heal you, and release you. Tell your story. Let it twist and remix your shattered heart. Tell your story until your past stops tearing your present apart.
Thank you so much, Lebo. We've come to the end of our exchange. Thanks very wonderfully. And para nuestros compañeros que nos han acompañado a lo largo de esta sesión, le decimos gracias y tenemos que quedar atentos porque tendríamos otras sesiones en el marco de este programa para posibilitar el intercambio entre África y América Latina a través del arte, a través de la poesía, a través de la literatura. La poesía es el amor, la poesía es el cuerpo, la poesía es la vida. Gracias.